800 diamonds. That is how many stones were sewn into the tiara that rested on Diana Spencer's head on the morning of July 29, 1981. 800 small, cold, perfect pieces of light, catching the sun through the windows of Clarence's house as she prepared to become the most photographed bride in human history. The world watched. 750 million people, glued to their screens, saw only the glow, the dress, the veil, the diamonds catching the light like a constellation pulled down from the sky and placed gently on the head of a girl who was barely 20 years old. Nobody asked what those diamonds had seen before that morning. Nobody asked what secrets were stitched into the gold beneath them. And nobody, not one person in those 750 million, was thinking about the woman Diana despised, the woman she had given a name so cutting it could draw blood, the woman who, years later, would become the one person Diana turned to when everything else had fallen apart. That woman's name was Raine Spencer. And this is her story as much as it is the story of a tiara. Because here is what the fairy tale left out. This crown, so luminous and so revered, was not some ancient, untouchable heirloom handed down through centuries of spotless grace. It was rebuilt, reassembled from fragments of other jewels, other lives, other women who wore it and then vanished from the history books. It had been taken apart and put back together, just like the family that owned it. And at the center of that family, quietly enduring a war that the newspapers only half understood, stood a woman who was called tasteless, opportunistic, and worse. A woman Diana called Acid Raine, with a smile that let everyone know the nickname was not affectionate. In the next 20 minutes, we are going to follow these diamonds from their origins to an auction house, through a family feud sharp enough to cut glass, and into a dining room where two women sat across from each other and chose something neither of them had managed to choose for years. They chose forgiveness. We remember Diana as the woman the royal family tried to silence. But what happens when the victim becomes the one doing the silencing? What does it say about her and about us that we never asked that question? Before we talk about the war, we need to talk about the crown. Because the Spencer tiara is not what most people assume it is. It does not have the clean, unbroken lineage of a treasure passed reverently from mother to daughter across the centuries. Its history is messier than that, more human, more interesting. At its core, it is a gold and diamond construction. Warm metal threaded through with silver reflections, its surface alive with swirling patterns of stars and flowers. Delicate, almost botanical in feeling. The kind of object that looks as though it grew rather than was made. But the version Diana wore on her wedding day was not the tiara's original form. In 1927, English jewelers were commissioned to transform it. They did not simply polish it or repair it. They rebuilt it, grafting 4 additional floral motifs onto its surface, each one borrowed from other pieces in the Spencer diamond collection. Stones that had once belonged to other settings, other contexts, other women, were carefully removed and reattached here. The tiara absorbed them the way a river absorbs smaller streams, quietly, completely, without leaving a visible seam. And then came the brooch. In 1919, Lady Sarah Spencer, Diana's own grandmother, gave a diamond brooch as a wedding gift to Lady Cynthia Hamilton. It was a gesture of warmth, of celebration, of family continuity. But that brooch did not stay a brooch. It was eventually folded into the tiara as well, becoming its crowning element. A gift between women, transformed into something else entirely. That particular diamond, given in love, ended up resting above Diana's forehead on the most public day of her life, without most people having any idea where it came from. There was also a second tiara in the Spencer collection worth knowing about. It belonged to Lady Delia Spencer, Diana's great-aunt by connection, and it had been a wedding gift from the 6th Earl Spencer to his daughter in 1914. 800 large and small diamonds set into a design so precisely engineered that the entire piece could be dismantled and worn as a necklace instead. A transformer, a shapeshifter, an object that could be one thing in public and something entirely different in private. The Spencer women, it seems, had a taste for jewelry that concealed its own complexity. That same tiara, the one from Lady Delia's collection, later graced the wedding of Sandra Paul, Diana's niece. It moved through the family like a quiet inheritance, touching one life after another, accumulating meaning the way old objects do. Not through grand declarations, but through proximity, through presence. But a tiara, no matter how dazzling, is just metal and stone. It takes a human hand to turn it into a weapon. And that hand was about to arrive at Althorp House, carrying a suitcase, wearing a smile that the Spencer children would spend the next decade trying to wipe away. Her name was Raine McCorkadale, and she arrived in the Spencer children's lives the way a storm arrives on a clear afternoon, with almost no warning and with consequences that would take years to fully measure. She was not an ingenue. She was not a wallflower. By the time she met John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, in the mid-1970s, Raine had already lived several lives that most women of her era could barely imagine. She had been a London councillor. She had served on government bodies. She had been married before, twice, to men of standing, and she had navigated those relationships on her own terms, maintaining her independence in ways that aristocratic society found quietly threatening. Her mother was Barbara Cartland, the most widely read romance novelist in the world, a woman draped perpetually in pink chiffon and pearls, whose books sold in the hundreds of millions, and whose opinions arrived with the force of natural law. Raine had grown up in the shadow of that extraordinary, overwhelming personality. She had learned early how to hold her ground. When she and John Spencer fell in love, the feeling was genuine. Anyone who watched them together could see it. He called her his salvation. She called him Johnny, softly, as though the name itself were something precious. They married in 1977, quietly, without the fanfare that might have softened the blow for his children. The blow was not softened. Diana was 16 years old when her father remarried. Her brother Charles was 13. Her sisters Sarah and Jane were older, but no less hostile. What followed was not a gradual cooling. It was an immediate, coordinated, and sustained rejection. The Spencer children closed ranks against Raine with the efficiency of people who had decided the verdict before the trial began. The nicknames came first. Quote Zero was Diana's contribution, a play on the environmental crisis dominating the headlines of the early 1980s, repackaged as a weapon. It was clever in the way that only real contempt can be clever. It spread. It stuck. It followed Raine into rooms before she arrived and lingered after she left. Then came the accusations. Gold digger, kept woman, social climber. The British press, always hungry, picked up the scent. Here was a ready-made villain, a twice-divorced woman with grand tastes who had inserted herself into an aristocratic family and was now, allegedly, redecorating Althorp House with all the restraint of someone who had never seen restraint and had no interest in making its acquaintance. The remodeling of Althorp became a particular obsession. Diana accused Raine of stripping the house of its character, of replacing centuries of careful accumulation with something garish and nouveau. The accusations were delivered not in private, but in front of journalists, in front of friends, in front of anyone who would listen. Diana had a gift for the cutting phrase delivered with perfect timing. She used that gift on her stepmother without mercy. And through all of it, Raine did not retaliate. Not publicly. Not once. She worked. She maintained her own income, her own professional identity, her own financial independence from a husband who had never needed to provide it. She was not the kept woman they described. She was a woman who had chosen to be present in a family that had chosen, with equal deliberateness, to make her feel absent. Raine Spencer was never the villain of this story. She was the only adult in the room, and she paid the price for it. But Diana's contempt wasn't just whispered behind closed doors. It was performed, publicly, deliberately, and with the kind of precision that only real hatred can produce. Let us be precise about what Diana actually did. This was not the ordinary friction of a child resisting a step-parent. It was not sulking at the dinner table or refusing to make conversation at Christmas. What Diana orchestrated against Raine Spencer was a sustained campaign, and it was conducted with a sophistication that should give us pause, because it came from a young woman who was simultaneously telling the world she understood what it felt like to be an outsider. The nickname Acid Raine was only the beginning. Diana deployed it in front of journalists with a brightness in her eyes that made it land as wit rather than cruelty. The reporters laughed. They printed it. Raine's name became a punchline before most people had any clear sense of who she actually was. At family gatherings, the Spencer children operated as a unit. They spoke to each other across Raine as though she were furniture. They arranged seating, conversations, and plans in ways that left her visibly, deliberately isolated. Raine would enter a room and the temperature would drop. Not metaphorically, but in the way that rooms genuinely change when the people inside them have agreed, without words, to make someone feel unwelcome. The accusations about Althorp grew louder and more specific over time. Diana told anyone who would listen that Raine had gutted the house, sold off family treasures, replaced irreplaceable things with imitations, redecorated in ways that amounted to a kind of vandalism. Some of these accusations had a kernel of truth. Some did not. But the way they were delivered, publicly, repeatedly, with Diana's name and face attached, transformed them into something closer to a verdict than a complaint. And here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Diana was not wrong to feel the loss of her mother. She was not wrong to feel the disruption of Raine's arrival in her father's life. She was 15 years old when her parents' marriage collapsed. 15, and already carrying a grief that had nowhere clean to go. Frances Spencer, Diana's mother, had left the family home when Diana was 6. 6 years old, and she woke up one morning to find that the person who was supposed to be permanently present had become permanently absent. That wound did not close. It calcified. And when Raine appeared in her father's life, warm and vivid and clearly intending to stay, something in Diana responded not just with jealousy, but with a kind of terror. Raine was not the cause of the pain, but she was standing in the place where the pain lived. None of which excuses what Diana did. Understanding a wound is not the same as endorsing the damage it causes. And the damage Raine absorbed year after year was real. She also had her own jeweled claim to elegance, a fact that Diana could not have missed. Raine had inherited a diamond tiara with pearl festoons from her mother, Barbara Cartland. It was a piece of genuine beauty, and like the Spencer tiaras, it could be transformed into a necklace, as though the women in Raine's line, like the women in Diana's, had always understood that the most powerful things are the ones that can change their shape without losing their worth. Diana wanted Raine gone, but fate had a crueler twist planned, because the man they were both fighting over was about to collapse, and only one of them would fight to save him. In 1978, 1 year after their marriage, John Spencer collapsed. He was at a party when it happened. One moment he was present, laughing, talking, the Earl of Spencer in full command of a room the way men of his background are trained to be. The next moment, he was on the floor. A stroke, severe enough that the doctors who treated him in those first hours were not certain he would survive the night. He survived the night, but the weeks that followed were desperate ones. The stroke had done damage that the standard treatments of the time could not adequately address. John Spencer was improving, but slowly. Too slowly, in the opinion of the woman who sat beside his hospital bed and refused, with a quiet ferocity that the nursing staff found equal parts admirable and exhausting, to accept that slowly was good enough. Raine began making calls. She contacted specialists. She researched. She pushed through bureaucratic walls that most people would have accepted as permanent. She located an experimental drug, one that was not yet widely available in Britain, one that required special authorization to obtain, one that the medical establishment regarded with the particular caution reserved for things that have not yet been proven wrong. Raine did not find this caution persuasive. She obtained the drug. She fought for it to be administered. And John Spencer began, against the more conservative expectations of his medical team, to recover. He recovered, fully enough to return to Althorp, fully enough to continue his life with the woman who had refused to let him leave it. Picture that for a moment. Picture Raine Spencer in those hospital corridors, not young, not naive, not the frivolous social creature the tabloids had constructed from Diana's descriptions. Picture her in a chair that was not designed for sleeping, in clothes that had been worn for too many consecutive hours, holding a telephone receiver and arguing with people who outranked her in every official sense, but who she simply would not allow to have the final word. While she was doing that, his children were not there. That is a fact, and it sits uncomfortably, and it should. The boycott did not lift for the hospital room. The coldness that the Spencer children had perfected in drawing rooms and at dinner tables did not thaw in the face of their father's medical crisis. Raine nursed him largely alone, sustained by her own resolve, by the specific and unshowy love she had for this man she called Johnny, and by a sense of duty that nobody who had called her a kept woman had apparently expected her to possess. She never spoke about it publicly. She did not go to the press with the story of what she had done while his children stayed away. She did not use it as leverage. She did not, at any point, offer it as evidence in the case she could have been building against the people who had made her life so difficult for so long. She simply did it. And then she continued. That is what love actually looks like, stripped of the romantic language that Barbara Cartland's novels had taught the world to expect. It does not look like diamonds and declarations. It looks like a woman in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m, arguing with a specialist about an experimental drug because the alternative is unthinkable. Raine saved his life. But she couldn't save him forever. And when death finally came for Johnny Spencer, His children came for her. John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, died on March 29, 1992. He was 68 years old. He had lived 14 years longer than the doctors who treated his stroke had expected. He had spent those 14 years at Althorp with the woman who had fought for them, walking the grounds, managing the estate, building a life that, whatever the outside world thought of it, had been real and warm and theirs. Raine was 62 when she became a widow. She had been married to Johnny for 15 years. She had saved his life, shared his bed, weathered the sustained hostility of his children, and loved him with a consistency that required no audience and sought no applause. And then, before the grief had time to settle into its permanent shape, the machinery began to move. Charles Spencer, Diana's younger brother, now the 9th Earl, inherited Althorp. That was expected. That was how these things worked. But what followed was not simply the transfer of a title and an estate. It was something closer to an erasure. Raine was informed that her presence at Althorp was no longer required. Not in those words, perhaps. The language of aristocratic displacement is rarely so direct. But the meaning was clear. The house she had lived in for 15 years, the rooms she had decorated and been mocked for decorating, the grounds she had walked with a man who was now beyond walking, none of it belonged to her. None of it had ever belonged to her. She had been, in the eyes of inheritance law, a guest, and guests, eventually, leave. There were negotiations, there were lawyers, there were conversations conducted in the particular tone that English solicitors reserve for situations where emotion must be managed and suppressed. The details of those conversations have never been fully disclosed. What emerged from them was a settlement, a departure, and a silence. Raine left Althorp. She took her clothing, her personal effects, the tiara she had inherited from her mother. She did not take the Spencer jewels. Those belonged to the estate now, to the family that had never accepted her as family, to the legacy she had helped preserve but could not claim. Picture her in those final days at the house. Picture the packing of boxes, the sorting of possessions, the quiet violence of deciding what belongs to you and what was only ever borrowed. Picture the staff, some of whom had known her for 15 years, some of whom had seen her fight for Johnny's life, some of whom had perhaps been kind to her in private, even when they could not be kind to her in public, watching her prepare to go. She did not make a scene. She did not give interviews. She did not, despite having every reason to do so, tell the world what it had felt like to be treated as an intruder in her own home for 15 years, and then to be removed from that home within weeks of her husband's death. The tabloids, of course, were watching. They had always been watching, and they were hungry for Raine to play the part they had assigned her, the bitter stepmother, the scorned widow, the woman who would finally reveal the dirt she had been accumulating for a decade and a half. She gave them nothing. Could you forgive someone who tried to erase you from your own home, from the life you built with the person you loved most? But Diana was about to learn something that Raine already knew. She was about to learn what it felt like to be cast out, stripped of title, and made to feel that the life she had built was never truly hers to keep. In 1996, Diana became an outsider. The divorce from Charles was finalized in August of that year. The terms were published. The settlement was substantial, money enough to maintain the life she had grown accustomed to, residences, staff, access to her sons. But there was one detail in those terms that cut deeper than any financial calculation. Diana lost her title. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. She was Diana, Princess of Wales, a distinction that might seem trivial to anyone who has never lived inside the architecture of royal protocol. But to Diana, who had spent 15 years building an identity inside that architecture, who had been told in 1,000 small ways that her worth was inseparable from her position, the loss was not trivial. It was an amputation. The newspapers covered her constantly, as they always had, but the tone was shifting. Where once she had been the fairy tale princess, the people's champion, the luminous victim of a cold and distant palace, she was now something more complicated. A divorced woman in her mid-30s, a mother navigating shared custody, a public figure without a clear role, an outsider. And somewhere in that new wilderness, Diana remembered Raine. Not the Raine she had constructed in her mind for 2 decades, the villain, the intruder, the woman with acid for blood. But the other Raine, the one who had endured boycotts without retaliating, the one who had been called a kept woman while maintaining her own career, the one who had been evicted from her home and had said nothing to the press, the one who had, year after year, absorbed cruelty with a grace that Diana was only now beginning to understand. Raine reached out first. When news of the divorce became public, Raine sent a message of genuine sympathy, not gloating, not vindication, just the simple recognition of one woman to another. I know what it is to lose the life you thought you were building. I am sorry you are going through this. Diana accepted. What followed was a dinner, just the two of them, in a private setting, away from the cameras that had documented every other chapter of their intertwined story. We do not know exactly what was said. We do not have transcripts or recordings. What we have are the accounts that emerged later, from Raine herself, from those close to both women, from the fragments that survive when private moments become public history. They sat across from each other, 2 women who had spent years as adversaries, now occupying the same space without hostility for perhaps the first time. The room was quiet. The lighting was soft. The specific details, the color of the tablecloth, the flowers on the table, the wine that may or may not have been poured, are lost to us now. But the weight of the moment is not. Diana thanked her, not in the formal, hollow way that public figures thank people they do not mean to thank. She thanked her for loving Johnny, for taking care of him, for being present during the years when his own children had been absent, for doing the work that nobody had acknowledged and everybody had criticized, for staying when leaving would have been so much easier. Raine listened, and then they embraced. 15 years of ice. 15 years of acid rain and boycotts and public humiliations and private wounds. 15 years of 2 women circling each other like satellites, locked in an orbit neither had chosen. And then, in one quiet room, the orbit broke. Diana left that dinner having said the words she needed to say. Raine left, having heard them. Whatever else happened between them after that night, and there was not much time left for anything else to happen, that moment was complete. 2 women, separated by years of pain, found their way back to each other. But this story has one final chapter, and it takes place not in a dining room, but in an auction house. On a spring morning in 2016, the Spencer Tiara went up for auction. Not the one Diana wore on her wedding day. That particular piece remains with the Spencer family, locked away, brought out only for the most significant occasions. This was the other one, Lady Delia's tiara, the transformer. 800 diamonds that could become a necklace with the unfastening of a few careful clasps. The auction house presented it with the appropriate reverence, a piece of aristocratic heritage, a jewel connected, however distantly, to one of the most famous women of the 20th century. The bidding opened, the paddles rose, and when the gavel finally fell, the price was £70,000. £70,000, a significant sum by any ordinary measure. But for a piece of jewelry that had touched the edges of the Diana story, it felt almost modest. 1 year later, the tiara appeared again. Different auction house, different presentation. This time, the marketing had been refined. The catalog copy emphasized the royal connection more heavily. The photographs were lit to catch every facet, every sparkle, every echo of the glamour that had once surrounded the Spencer women. The tiara was no longer simply a beautiful object with an interesting provenance. It was now, according to the promotional materials, a piece of jewelry worthy of royalty. The bidding opened higher. The paddles rose faster. And when the gavel fell this time, the price was £185,000, nearly 3 times what it had sold for 12 months earlier, for the same object, the same diamonds, the same gold and silver and history. The only thing that had changed was the story being told about it, and the willingness of someone, somewhere, to pay for proximity to a ghost. We do not know who bought it. The sale was anonymous, as these sales often are. Perhaps it sits now in a private collection, displayed under glass, admired by visitors who know the story and visitors who do not. Perhaps it has been dismantled again, transformed back into a necklace, or broken into smaller pieces, or absorbed into yet another configuration we cannot predict. What we know is that someone understood something important about the Spencer tiara and about Diana herself. They understood that memory has a market value, that grief can be monetized, that the further we get from a person's actual life, the more freely we can reshape their image into whatever sells. Diana died on August 31st, 1997. She was 36 years old. The car crash in Paris ended a life that had been public property since she was 19. Photographed, analyzed, celebrated, criticized, mourned, and ultimately transformed into a story that belongs more to us than it ever belonged to her. The reconciliation with Raine happened barely a year before that crash. One dinner, one embrace, one moment of grace after 15 years of cruelty. If Diana had died 12 months earlier, that moment would never have happened. The ice would have remained unbroken. The last chapter of their story would have been eviction and silence, and 2 women who never found their way back to each other. But she did not die 12 months earlier. She lived just long enough to sit across from the woman she had called Acid Raine and to say, finally, "Thank you." Raine Spencer lived until 2016. She remarried twice after Johnny's death, both times to men of title, both times on her own terms. She never stopped being the woman the tabloids had decided she was in 1977. And she never, not once, used what she knew to tear down Diana's memory. She could have. She had decades of material. She chose silence instead. That is what this story is actually about. Not the diamonds, not the tiaras, not the transformers that shift between necklace and crown. It is about two women who were handed a relationship neither of them wanted and who spent years making each other miserable, and then, against every expectation, chose to stop. 800 diamonds caught the light on July 29, 1981. The world saw only the glow. But now you know what those diamonds actually witnessed. A family at war with itself. A woman who refused to retaliate. A princess who learned, almost too late, what it cost to be cruel. And a dinner table where two people decided that forgiveness was more valuable than being right. The auction house sold a tiara, but what they were really selling was a dead woman's name. And we bought it, every single one of us, every time we click on a story about Diana, including this one.